Welcome to Charts Today. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Tuesday, the 15th of January, comes to you from London. And we start by looking at the dollar, just climbing a little bit, and looking a little bit better on the short-term chart. Although we still do have these downside targets for the short term hanging over us, as much as 1 to 2.5% downside percentage-wise. So the dollar is really not off to a great start this year, and we see here we are probably just finding some support on the lagging line in the cloud and maybe some resistance on the long-term chart. Remember, this is my weekly 1%, my daily 0.5% point figure, and my short-term 60-minute and 0.1% on the 60-minute chart. So this is my long-term view, my medium-term view, and my short-term view. And we see here that the dollar is looking better short-term, but it'll be this chart this year that we need to watch. Will it wander back into positive territory? Looking at the euro, we see the euro is actually just entering negative territory against the dollar. This is the euro dollar chart, and we're bearish here on the short term. We do have a couple of upside targets, but at the moment the chart is looking more and more bearish. So bearish on the euro versus the dollar. That dollar yen chart is really key, and we're seeing how the dollar has really deteriorated against the yen this year. So strong yen, weak dollar, but we actually are seeing the dollar strength still kicking in here on the short-term chart, and that is often a lead indicator, so we wouldn't be surprised to see the dollar strengthening in other places. Sterling up quite solidly, which is quite interesting given the Brexit vote today and the uncertainty around that, but sterling is actually climbing. It's looking better short-term, but medium and long-term against the dollar still bearish, and against the euro it jumped on Friday and is holding most of those gains, but still looking bearish in the medium and long-term chart. Against the Swiss franc, we're seeing sterling also improve, but again, short and long, medium and long-term, it's still bearish. And against the Aussie dollar, just as another quick check, sterling looking not as strong there. Bitcoin is up very slightly, and is in positive territory on the 60-minute chart, but it is still looking very bearish from the long and medium-term charts. US stock markets were down yesterday. We saw the S&P 500 index down about 0.5%, and the Nasdaq we saw also down nearly 1%. So quite big sell-offs there in the US. The chart really does have this risk of rolling over, making a lower high, and then moving to a lower low. If we see new lows, of course, that is bearish. We haven't quite confirmed the bearishness on the long-term chart on the Nasdaq 100. On the S&P 500 we have, and if we look at the Dow, also seeing the Dow Jones is just looking a little bit more bearish long-term. The Russell 2000 also is actually looking bearish, and so from a market breadth perspective, the broader market in the US is still a worry. Seeing the futures up this morning, the S&P future up 0.6%, the Nasdaq E-mini future up 0.75%. So it does suggest the US market will open higher, and we've seen the FTSE and the DAX futures up strongly this morning. Looking at the cash index, the FTSE index is up 0.75%, so that's looking a bit better. We do have some short-term targets on the FTSE 100 to 7,100, 7,143. So it does look like we will get back above the 7,000 level, and that's some 3% upside potential still there on the short-term chart, but the long and medium-term charts are worrying. Looking at the FTSE 250, we're bearish on the long and medium term here as well. Short term, we don't have any clear upside targets. We've met the target that was given off the low, so it is hard to call how much higher UK mid-caps can go. The DAX is up nearly 1.2% this morning, so that's looking a lot better, and we have got good short-term upside targets here, but again, the medium and long-term charts aren't great. Of course, nearly all of this is academic. It's what the US market does, and that's what we need to keep an eye on. The CAC Quarante also looking better this morning at 1.1%, so short term looking better. And we're looking over to Asia now quickly. The Japanese market up nearly 1%. The Hang Seng was up 2%, so that's a really big move for the Hang Seng, and the Shanghai Composite up 1.4%. So we are seeing some quite big moves there, and the Sensex up 1%. 1.5%. So sentiment pretty strong on the bullish side today, and the Aussie market up 0.7%. Brent crude is up 0.75% this morning, so that's a proxy for sentiment being quite solid. We are still just a little bit bearish on that short-term chart just below the cloud, and we do have a downside target hanging over. So it is interesting to note that Brent crude or crude oil generally goes up in the first quarter quite strongly of the year. So the seasonal effect may well kick in and we'll see further rises. WTI similar, although we do have two short-term downside targets. US nat gas jumped further. We're sitting at $3.60. We're seeing a lot of volatility in the chart on the nat gas price. So really interesting that we're seeing these jumps. But you'll remember that we were in November, December, we got as high as $4.90. If we break that high, that would be very, very significant. Cold weather having an impact there in the US. Gold is off this morning, off 0.25% on that better sentiment all round, and we're just seeing that gold is coming off a little bit. So the risk trade is coming off at the moment, and silver actually down slightly as well, down 1/3%, and just not looking quite as good as gold. US 10-year yields still pretty weak at 2.7%, and bonds in Europe actually down a little bit this morning, as we're seeing bond yields fairly flat as well. Looking at the tech stocks, just looking at the 60-minute charts before we look over to Yahoo data. This is all coming from Thomson Reuters Icon. If you're a private user, Metastock Zenith, it's the same feed as a really brilliant feed. So here we see Apple just still bearish, and Alphabet was just turning into bearish territory there, and Facebook actually holding on quite successfully yesterday on Facebook, and Amazon as well. Moving over to the individual stocks, if we look at Asia, we see a sea of green here, some very strong performances in Asia. We had the COPSI up 1.6%, for example, and we are just seeing across the board, the only market down actually in the region was New Zealand. So we are seeing strong performance despite those big moves yesterday. We saw the Nasdaq 100 down 0.9%. This data all coming to you from Yahoo. It's daily data updated live on your screens. And so here I'm running my weekly chart, my long term, my medium term daily. Because I don't have the 60-minute data from Yahoo, I tend to look at the on-balance volume just to give me a heads up as to whether the volume is confirming the price, and a relative strength chart to the Dow set to the beginning of last year. At some point, I will switch that over to the beginning of this year once we've got a little bit more data under our belts for the year. Taking a look at the market, though, we saw the Nasdaq was a sea of red yesterday. No big surprises there. And in fact, if we just rank by performance, we had some really big falls yesterday. Western Digital down 4.9%, Win Resources down 4.8%, Microchip down 3.75%. So a lot of these stocks are in downturns. Tesla down 3.7%. So we did see some quite big falls. And looking on the other side, there were a handful of stocks up, but mostly we're seeing that fall across the board. The bellwethers, of course, are Apple. Taking a look at Apple here, we're just struggling to hold support on this long-term chart, so that is a little bit worrying, and we're seeing how the relative is just falling away. Google, if we look at Alphabet, we see much the same thing, just falling away a bit there, and Amazon also just holding on to its long-term trend, unlike most other stocks, and the relative still looking pretty good. So Amazon has been a good outperformer. And we just take a look at some of the others. Facebook was actually up yesterday, so they bucked the market trend. Still looking pretty terrible though as a chart. And if we look at some of the others, Microsoft was down 0.7%. So again, just underperforming there, but probably not bad as bad as the market. And Netflix was down 1.4%. So some quite big moves there as well. Taking a look at the Aussie market, simply just clicking on the percentage column, we see there were some pretty big rises here. Navitas up 12%, Sierra Resources up 10%. Just starting to buck some trends there, so that will be interesting. Looking on the other side, Ausdrill down a further 5%. They've had a terrible time the last year or so. Speedcast International, again, catastrophic falls there, and Coca-Cola, the Aussie listed entity, also looking pretty bad. So we are seeing a lot of these charts still looking pretty bearish, and we've got price targets for them as well. Of course, you can do this on any list, and if you have any of these stocks, you can just simply just click on the stock, and you'll get immediately the trends and the targets and the relative performance. Taking a look at China, we mentioned that China was up quite strongly. We see that a sea of green, and we're seeing here the Chinese stocks still look pretty terrible. Only 2 stocks down, so this is really a big counter trend move for China. We did see quite a strong performance there, and the Hang Seng, much the same picture, of course. We're seeing AAC up 5%. And if we look at Greeley Automotive, up 4.6%. And just a key proxy, when we look at the percentage fallers, none in the Hang Seng Index. So it really is a very, very strong performance. The Nifty in India, if we look at the Nifty 50 here, again, we've got Wipro up 5%. So that's quite significant. They are looking really solid as a stock. You can see the long-term trends are all intact. Outperformance is pretty good. Looking at Yes Bank, they have rebounded, but still the chart looks terrible. Infosys, like Wipro, is holding on and very much back into bullish territory on that medium-term chart. Fallers in India, we just had a handful. Looking at the Nikkei, again, we just see some pretty big performances here. Olympus up 17%. They were a strong performer. They really rocketed, nearly doubling in value over the last few weeks. So we really are seeing that there are some potential opportunities in the market. It's just got to find them. Moving over to Europe now for the opening, we start by looking at let's start by looking at the FTSE 100. Remembering this data all coming through on Yahoo, and so first thing to do is just to rank by performance. And yesterday, Smurfit Kappa were one of the worst performers. They're actually up 2.5%, recovering a little bit today as the leader. London Stock Exchange Group up 2%. They're back into bullish territory on the medium-term chart. The long-term chart looking pretty good. So not everything is in downtrend. So LSE is looking pretty good. If we take a look at Rolls-Royce Holdings, they're up 1.8% and looking a little bit better as well. Sage had a terrible time last year, and we see that again they're just starting to move into positive territory. The fallers today, we have got a handful. Paddy Power is the worst performer, down 2.4%. ITV down nearly 2%. And if we look at Taylor Wimpey, down 1.4%. So we are seeing, interestingly here, we've got a list of stocks like Whitbread, Persimmon, Barrett Developments. Housebuilders been a little bit hit there by the looks of things, but again, it is mainly a sea of green today in the market. Looking at the FTSE 250 for the UK market, we see here Spirent up 8%, Hayes up 4%. So we're seeing some pretty big moves there. And on the downside, we have got some pretty big falls too. We've got Provident Financial down 19-20% this morning, so they've really fallen away. Spire Healthcare Group down 12%. So we are still getting these big falls in places. So that is a little bit of a concern. Looking to the Euro Stock 600, this is the top 600 stocks in Europe, just ranking by percentage here. We see the best performers in France. In fact, we've got Ferrero up 5.7%. We've got Company Plastique up 4%, and Spy up 4%. So these are all these prices coming in live off Yahoo as we speak. These are all French companies at the top of the leaderboard. On the downside, we've got Sartorius in Germany. They're down 3.7%. And we've got an Irish company here again, Glanbia, down 3.4%. So we are seeing just some falls away there, but on the whole, the market's looking pretty bullish today, and of course those US futures pointing to higher prices, so keep an eye on your charts. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.